did the Olmecs really just arrive out of nowhere without any outside influence at all? One thing that's commonly talked about is, do the Olmecs have some kind of African origin? People look at the Olmec heads, and it's very popular to say, oh, well, they look like they have the big noses and the big lips, and they look like they're African. And I'm going to address that in a second. But one of the actual pieces of evidence that I see for Africans in the Mesoamerican and Caribbean world is something that's really, really strange in linguistics. So when Columbus showed up in the Bahamas and then later moved into the Caribbean, he met Carib people who had metal alloy tipped bows, arrows, and spears. And what they called that alloy, and Columbus is obviously looking for riches now. He's looking for things to send back to Spain to make money to keep funding further expeditions, and he wants to, set up colonies and really, exploit the New World, extract it for everything it's worth. He's asking them, where are these metal alloys from? And they say, it's guanine, it's guanine. It comes from these dark-skinned sailors that came up from the Southeast Seas. And again, what the Caribs had very dark skin. So if they're calling other tribes dark-skinned people, that means that the other people had very, very dark skin, which would be unlike what we see in the ancient Americas. Now, in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, metal alloy is called guanin. So in the Caribbean, when Columbus arrives, it's called guanine. In the ancient sub-Saharan African cultures, they call their metal alloys guanin. So you see just this little tiny nugget of evidence for African presence in the Mesoamerican world. With that, I want to say that Olmec heads actually do look like Veracruz people. We were at this little museum, and I knock on the door, and it takes 5 minutes for somebody to answer. And when this guy does answer, he's this big, tall, 6'5", heavy-set guy, and I look up at him, and I immediately go, oh, that's an Olmec head on this guy's body. He had the big lips, he had the big nose, the big eyes, the big chubby cheeks, and I was like, I'm definitely in the right place. And so they absolutely do look like people in the Olmec world. However, I cannot explain this monument. This is another tenon head in the Olmec world. This is the largest tenon head. Just the head itself is about this big, and the tenon on the back of it is about as long as I am tall. So I cannot explain this. There is no explanation for it. You ask the archaeologists there, and they say, oh, it's Olmec. I'm like, that's not Olmec. It's something different. Again, though, there's absolutely no context for these artifacts, and all we can do is look at it and find these little tiny kernels of evidence that may allude to the idea that possibly seafaring sub-Saharan Africans were visiting these areas, and possibly they're depicted on iconography. But I definitely don't think that the traditional Olmec heads depict Africans. However, this guy, just not sure. However, we get to something that's one of my favorites, is this is Monument 13 here on the left. And in Monument 13, I'm going to have to use my pointer finally. In Monument 13, we see a couple of interesting things that aren't really depicted elsewhere in the Olmec world. So we see this guy wearing this long draping headdress. Does this look like any of the other Olmec headdresses I've been showing you guys, where it's like kind of a long turban hanging off his head? No. This right here, you can see he's got boots on with pointed shoes. We have no prevalence for boots. Later on in Mesoamerica, they start inventing sandals and wearing sandals, but for the vast majority of time, these guys had monkey feet. They had really, really strong feet, and they're walking everywhere barefooted. We also see that he has a belt kind of hanging off with like a little draping cloth on the end, and he's also holding a flag. He also has a thick mustache and a thick beard coming down. And that's all great, except none of these have a prevalence in the Mesoamerican world. In fact, flags are actually one of the places that they're invented is the Nakata cultures, which is pre-dynastic Egypt. So they have these little reed boats going up and down the Nile, and they plant these little flags on it to show the tribe and village that they're from. And this is very, very early prehistoric Egypt. So flags come from the Mediterranean world. Flags were not used in Mesoamerica. Furthermore, these big, thick, dense beards that's depicted here, these are not Mesoamerican either. Mesoamericans were sort of I mean, they're even known today. If you look at photos of Native Americans during the 1800s, they have completely clean faces, and if they do have a beard, it's very, very, it's not a thick beard like you see in the Mediterranean world. So this monument right here, and then let alone, I should say, turbans. I mean, that is a Mediterranean headdress. Nobody in the Native Americans were wearing turbans. Now, this monument here is dated to be around 900 BC because it was found sitting just above a tomb with a body that when it was carbon dated, they think that the body was about 900 BC. Now, how concrete that is, you've got to answer that for yourself. But right here, we also see a man depicted from San Lorenzo. Now, this is kind of like a terracotta head. Now, this terracotta head with these high cheekbones and this pointed chin with this little beard and the mustache and the turban as well, not Mesoamerican whatsoever. Now, at 900 BC, a civilization called the Phoenicians, which were kind of in some ways, they were like a roaming tribe around the Mediterranean. They were fantastic sailors. They were sending out expeditions through the gates of Hercules around Africa and then back. And so they were going to be one of the first cultures to sail all the way around Africa and map that sea. Now, what's interesting is these Phoenician records show that some of these expeditions went off and never came back. Or one that did come back said that they found this giant island landmass with absolutely nobody living on it, and that's kind of the end. Some of these records are found on these clay tablets, and there's just almost no evidence of this anymore. Now, what researchers have been finding is that if you send a boat out of the gates of Hercules, which is, the exit of the Mediterranean Sea into the Atlantic Ocean, if you send it just a little bit too far out and you send it a little bit too far west, the current of the Atlantic Ocean will actually carry it all the way across the Atlantic, down into the Bahamas, through the Caribbean, and into the Gulf of Mexico. So it's possible that a lost Phoenician vessel could have found its way by following a current down into the Bahamas, the Caribbean, and then they interacted with what was the most developed culture at the time and made their way into a cameo on Olmec iconography. That's my theory, at least, and very few other people's theories.